Okay, hi friends. So this video is in some way a sequel to my last video, Is Bernie Really a Socialist? And as such, I will refrain from explaining like who Bernie is, why he's relevant, and whether he's as socialist as he and the right like to claim. However, today we will be covering a much more abstract and theory-heavy topic, whether the radical left should be excited about Bernie Sanders' candidacy given that he isn't a socialist. Again, watch my last video for my explanation of that. In other words, is Bernie Sanders a net positive for the radical left, i.e., Marxists, anarchists, etc., or is he problematic due to his comparatively moderate views? So I wish I could begin the video in the same way I did the last one with like a TLDR position, but to be honest, I'm really mixed on Bernie's impact. What I can do, however, is a couple disclaimers. So first, to repeat what I said in my intro video, I am a Marxist-Leninist, which means that despite the positive things I'll say about Bernie here, no, I'm not actually a social democrat or like a fake Marxist or whatever. So like my views don't line up with Bernie at all in terms of his and my end goals, so please don't expose me as like a counter-revolutionary or anything. And second, on the flip side of that, I am still like a kind of Bernie supporter. I have donated to his 2020 campaign. I plan to vote for him in the upcoming primaries in my state. So to my Bernie supporter friends, I ask that you guys also not expose me as like a counterproductive idealist or something. And one more logistical thing. Since this topic gets a little more abstract, I will be explaining some theoretical concepts. This unfortunately means that the video will be pretty quote heavy and explanation heavy. I'll try not to be too dry with it though. So, where to begin? I originally wanted to simply divide this video between like pros and cons of Bernie and his platform and go from there, but like fuck, man, it's a lot and there's so much overlap. So, I'm just going to define some terms one at a time and apply them to Bernie. Okay? Okay. So, definitions. Number one, the Overton window. The Overton window is a concept in political science that is basically the window, quote unquote, of what is acceptable within the politics of a given area. So, for example, imagine you're looking at the political compass tests. Here's an example. There's me, way over there on the left. The Overton window, or again, what people are politically comfortable with, could appear as a sort of box on that graph. So here's roughly what it might look like in a period of relative stability, such as, say, Obama's re-election in 2012. Notice how I, a Marxist-Leninist, am way outside of that box. This means that if I took to the streets talking about like workers' revolution, people would probably call me crazy because no one would deem it necessary to overthrow capital and institute radical actions at that time. And that's for a multitude of reasons, most likely the stability, the fact that there's not an impending doom kind of feeling. So here is another example, and that's probably what it would look like in the height of the Cold War with all of its like anti-communist propaganda, which kind of like demonized all leftist strategy and, views. Now this is what Marxists might want it to look like, where we are included as like a realistic alternative to other political voices. But this is what is more realistic and consistent with Marxist theory, though. I would love to talk about this concept more, but basically we think that capitalism is bound to hit crisis eventually, and when that happens, people will reject the status quo and rush to the extremes of leftism and fascism, extremes, quote unquote. Okay, we're done with the first definition. I'm sorry for the dryness of that, but how it's relevant to Bernie is actually really simple and easy to follow. Before Bernie came along, much of his platform was straight up outside of relevancy. So things like Medicare for All, free college, the Green New Deal, whatever, all of those were brought into the spotlight. In other words, Bernie shifted the Overton window to the left. Of course, for the radical left, it hasn't been shifted far enough, but let's look at some indicators on how well the left is doing. So here is a tweet that shows the growth of the DSA after Bernie's exposure as a presidential candidate during the 2016 election. It's also worth noting that since then, the DSA's membership has more than doubled to 55,000 in less than 2 years after that, which is shown in this tweet from the official account. I do have a counterpoint to this, though, that I will address later. Now, second definition is Marxist historical materialism. So the cornerstone of Marxist philosophy is called dialectical materialism, which, for the purposes of this video, is roughly the same thing as historical materialism. What all that entails is mostly out of the scope of this video, but a very, very basic overview of what it means for society is in order to understand, my later arguments. So, in the very first few lines of the Communist Manifesto, Marx does this thing where he talks about like class society, which he views to sort of be the basis for pretty much everything else. And why he thought that is a whole nother conversation. But the relevant detail is the notion of societal progression, quote unquote, but we could also call it change. But we are often taught, in essence, that the progress, quote unquote, of society, so like desegregation, the legalization of gay marriage, whatever, is just like a constant thing that happens over time. So on a graph, it might look something like this, based on like liberal curriculum. But what Marxists think, though, is that it looks more like this if it were to be graphed. And what this means is basically that each event is the result of contradictions. So, like, imagine the hydraulic press channel's video about folding paper 8 times, where it, like, presses down and explodes the paper. Yeah, there you go. Now, that explosion happened because something, quote, gave in, I guess, between two contradicting forces, right? So, like, the force of the paper and its density and the force of the hydraulic press. Well, that's what we say about society and big changes that happen within it. For example, the competing demands of workers versus the competing demands of capitalists will eventually give in, resulting in some kind of radical movement for better or worse. And why is that relevant, you ask, almost falling asleep? Well, it's simple. The radical left, who want the forces to give in their favor, would benefit from their force being stronger, right? And it's my argument that Bernie's candidacy and rise to notoriety adds to the force of this new workers' movement. He brings awareness to the systemic realities that hold back the working class, even if his rhetoric is kind of faulty in that it skips over seriously important details about the inevitability of all of this under capitalism. So it's those two things that I believe are mostly in Bernie's favor, and now that we're clear on those terms, let's sum up that argument. So Bernie Sanders, a candidate who brings awareness to working class issues, has shown a positive correlation between left-wing membership and potentially engagement and the notoriety/fame of the Bern himself. This has the potential, yes, potential, I'll address that in a second, to contribute to the power, confidence, passion of the workers, which has, again, the potential to result in a successful radical workers' movement in the 21st century. And if that is to happen, it is unquestionably good. Bernie Sanders is unquestionably good for the radical left and our goals. Which brings me to my next question. Is it going to happen? Well, it could, which is what I meant by potential. And I think the likelihood of it happening is high enough that it serves as a huge positive for Bernie, but there is another possibility here. What if the Bernie wave is not capitalized upon by the radical left? What if the organizations like the DSA are transformed from being actually socialist to simply being moderate left, much like Bernie's platform is right now? Well, actually, that's already sort of happening. A survey was done in 2017 of DSA members asking them what their first, second, and third priorities are. Here were their answers. So some critics of Bernie and the modern DSA say things like imperialism being so unbelievably low on that list shows a problem with social democracy and Bernie's candidacy in that it frames struggle against top-down opposition as like a national one, when in reality, the United States' involvement in imperialist wars has been a scourge on the sovereignty of people and organizers across the globe for decades. And I would wholeheartedly agree with this criticism. The direction of the DSA is very worrying, to say the least, right now, because they seem to want to act as just like a progressive faction of the Democratic Party or just the arm of Bernie's campaign. There's nothing radical about that. There's nothing socialist about that. In fact, there's little productive about that. It's literally what Bernie's been doing on his own. And the DSA, instead of using this momentum to educate about socialism, gave the reins to a bunch of Bernie supporters. So now a socialist organization is largely now being run by not socialists. And that's a problem. It's a huge problem because it totally takes the wind out of the sails of the leftward momentum that the Bernie era has brought upon us. That is by far the strongest counterpoint to Bernie that I know of that comes from the left. But quickly, I do have one more. What if we don't have time for this? Capitalism is actively destroying the planet. Imperialism is killing thousands and costing trillions. Fascism is on the rise. Austerity is on the rise. Do we really have time for the United States to go through a social democratic phase while all these pressing issues are breathing down our necks? This is a question that I actually don't have an answer to. On one hand, it seems necessary for the Overton window to be dragged to the left in order for our ideas to be, ripe for a rise in popularity. On the other hand, how many have to die and suffer in the meantime while we sort our shit out? Well, I don't really know the answer to that question, but I might have a solution. Bernie Sanders is getting more exposure now than he has ever. This means that this is the perfect time to capitalize on the momentum that he generates. We don't make the same mistakes that the DSA made and let all socialist orgs turn into Medicare for All lobbies, but rather we fight Bernie's fight for things like Medicare for All while also maintaining our socialist goals and ideals. In other words, we kill two birds with one stone. We attack capital with what is popular today, things like Medicare for All, higher wages, and so on, and we educate our membership about the systemic reasons for these problems. This will create a left that is educated and ready for the impending crisis of capital and the fight that ensues. So, to return to the question, Bernie is extremely good for the radical left if we capitalize correctly and in a timely manner, and I can only hope we do, and I want to do my small part to make sure that we get there. Well, that's all I have for this video. Sorry for the dryness of some of the topics. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.